An extreme fact about myself is that I've been eating some form of ketogenic diet since the summer of 2006. You're probably thinking, wait, what? 2006? How are you even alive? Yes, you heard that right, 2006. In this video, I will discuss the ketogenic diet, research surrounding its potential effects on aging and physical performance, and practical tips based on my experience for those who want to try it out. Let's start with how I ended up living a ketogenic lifestyle for so long. At the end of my freshman year of high school, I developed an interest in optimizing my health, and I started investigating ways I could boost my mental and physical functioning. This started my quest for the dietary holy grail. It's a long story that I'll save for a future time, but basically I tried out most diets under the sun. I started out by transitioning to an omnivorous whole foods diet. I cut out the candy and processed food, started forcing myself to eat raw fruits and vegetables, and restricted my protein sources to nuts, cheese, eggs, and fresh meat. Going into my sophomore year of high school, I then removed the meat and became a vegetarian. As the year went on, I progressively grew more and more extreme, and about half a year later, I was a full-blown raw foodist vegan. I had cut out eggs and cheese and was only eating raw fruits, vegetables, seeds, and nuts. By the end of my vegan experiment a few months later, I was underweight, extremely fatigued, and just felt sickly and weak all the time. After learning more about chemistry, biology, and human evolution, I realized that raw foodist veganism isn't exactly the optimal human diet, and I had to admit to myself that I was wrong. My quest had gone far astray. Now, for those of you that are vegan, I understand that my approach wasn't the best way to do a vegan diet, and that it's possible to formulate and follow a vegan diet that won't send someone towards frailty and weakness. I also understand many are motivated to follow a vegan diet for ethical reasons rather than health reasons. For me personally, although there was an ethical motivation, this was secondary to the goal of optimizing my health. Thus, based on my new knowledge, I decided to transition to a so-called paleo diet. I kept most of the plant foods from before, but began incorporating free-range eggs, pasture-raised pork and chicken, wild-caught fish, and grass-fed beef into my diet. After doing paleo for a bit and feeling a lot better, I then abruptly switched to a purely carnivorous diet. Wait, a purely carnivorous diet? Where did that come from? Like I said, it's a long story I'll have to save for another time, but long story short, just prior to my junior year, I swung towards the other extreme, and I was eating a purely carnivorous, zero-carbohydrate diet, which is essentially just an extreme version of the ketogenic diet. At first, it was a rough transition. While adapting to more ketogenic metabolism, I was grappling with severe fatigue and brain fog, as well as feelings of queasiness from eating all the fat. In my case, since I had already been riding a dietary and blood sugar roller coaster, it took me about 3 months to become fully keto adapted. But once I was adapted to this new metabolic state, the changes to my health were profound. I felt like a new being. I'd never felt so energetic and focused in my life. My physical energy was enduring throughout the day. I almost never felt hungry. My mental focus was the sharpest it had ever been. I could basically exercise as long as I wanted, focus for unprecedented periods of time, learn more efficiently, and even grasp more complex thoughts. I felt like I had unlocked a near limitless reserve of energy that I could tap into at almost any time. After about a year of eating the diet, even my grades in school shot up. Before, I was lackadaisical about school and got a smattering of grades across the whole grade range. By my senior year, I was scoring straight A's. By the end of high school, I developed a more specific interest in achieving biological immortality, so I decided to continue on with the ketogenic diet as an experimental approach to taking one step closer towards living forever. Thus, I continued to eat this strict diet all the way through undergraduate schooling and into young adulthood. In 2013, after 7 years of eating a zero-carbohydrate diet, I started experimenting with carbohydrate refeeds for further optimizing muscle growth and athletic performance. And by October of 2013, I started eating a cyclical ketogenic diet, where I follow the usual strict ketogenic diet Monday through Friday and do a roughly 36-hour carb up on the weekend. The cyclical ketogenic diet is what I eat to this day. So what exactly was going on here with this diet? Let's dive into a brief review of the ketogenic metabolism. For those of you who want to skip ahead to the practical tips I put together based on my experience, go to 18 minutes and 14 seconds. The ketogenic diet works by practically eliminating carbohydrates from the diet. This initially depletes one's blood glucose, which in turn decreases blood insulin levels and increases glucagon and cortisol levels. causing the liver to release glycogen into the bloodstream as glucose to restore blood glucose levels. Additionally, this hormonal shift causes adipose tissue to release fatty acids into the bloodstream. When glycogen also becomes depleted, blood sugar levels begin to drop again, and liver cells start tapping more into oxaloacetate, a precursor molecule in the Krebs cycle, to convert into blood sugar. In parallel, liver cells have been uptaking the fatty acids released by the adipocytes and processing it into acetyl coenzyme A. The result is that in the mitochondria of liver cells, there's a relative scarcity of oxaloacetate and a relative abundance of acetyl coenzyme A. This excess acetyl coenzyme A, unable to enter into the Krebs cycle by reacting with oxaloacetate, is thus shunted to a series of reactions that generates one of the ketone bodies known as acetoacetate. Some of the acetoacetate is then reduced to beta-hydroxybutyrate, and a small fraction of the acetoacetate spontaneously breaks down into acetone. This whole sequence of steps that generates these three ketone bodies is the process of ketogenesis, and when the blood ketone concentration rises high enough, above half a millimole per liter, one is officially in a state of ketosis. These ketone bodies then transport from liver cells to various cells throughout the body, including brain, heart, kidney, lung, and muscle cells, where they are used as fuel to offset much of the need for glucose. Specifically, acetoacetate and beta-hydroxybutyrate can be converted back into acetyl coenzyme A and plugged into the Krebs cycle in these cells to generate energy. It's important to point out that although ketone bodies and free fatty acids replace much of the need for glucose throughout the body, there's still some requirement for it, particularly in the liver and the brain. To meet this requirement, the liver will perform what is called gluconeogenesis, which is the conversion of substrates like certain amino acids and the glycerol backbone of lipids into glucose. Basically, the amino acid substrates get fed into the Krebs cycle at various points, converted to oxaloacetate, and then converted from there into glucose, while glycerol and certain fatty acids are processed into glycolysis intermediates and then converted from there into glucose. This whole process maintains the blood glucose concentration within a narrow range while the body is in a ketogenic state. These ketone bodies are not only used for fuel, but they also modify genetic expression and ignite a cascade of effects in cells throughout the body. Beta-hydroxybutyrate, in particular, functions as a signaling molecule and epigenetic factor that can do everything from influence how tightly wound chromosomes are in certain locations, thus affecting gene expression, to keying into signaling pathways related to lipid metabolism, oxidative stress, and inflammation. The usage of this alternative fuel source has the potential to mitigate certain diseases. The ketogenic diet has been used as a treatment for epilepsy beginning in the early 20th century, and it continues to be used as an adjunctive treatment for intractable cases of the disorder. It has also been studied as a potential treatment for other diseases, including Alzheimer's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and cancer. There are promising preclinical studies that show effective mechanisms of action for the ketogenic diet in preventing and treating these diseases, though clinical evidence is still lacking and inconclusive at this point in time. We've reviewed at a high level how a ketogenic diet induces ketosis and how the resulting ketone bodies can cause a series of genetic and metabolic changes. Let's go into a little more detail and explore how these changes appear to stem aging and mitigate various diseases. Basically, you can think of ketosis as a form of pseudo-starvation that allows one to generate the benefits of such a state while maintaining adequate nutrient intake. Like other forms of dietary restriction and environmental challenge, it is a form of adversity that the body has evolved to grow stronger in response to. Like the case with most other diseases, there are currently no longitudinal studies on humans that have examined the effects of a ketogenic diet on aging. To be clear, this diet is currently an experimental approach. However, there does exist some very promising preclinical and animal research that suggests such a metabolic state can mitigate aging and age-related diseases, similar to other methods like caloric restriction. A 2021 review article called Beta-hydroxybutyrate as an Anti-Aging Metabolite discusses the main mechanisms of action that preclinical research has found through which the ketone body stems aging and age-related pathologies. First, beta-hydroxybutyrate interacts with G-protein-coupled receptors on the surfaces of cells, which activate molecular switches inside the cells that induce various effects. For example, beta-hydroxybutyrate binds to GPR109A on the surfaces of certain immune cells and adipocytes, which has the effect of limiting arterial plaque formation and lowering inflammation. These effects can potentially help prevent atherosclerosis and neuroimmune disorders such as Parkinson's disease. Second, beta-hydroxybutyrate works to reduce oxidative stress through various mechanisms. For example, it can directly scavenge hydroxyl radicals. It regulates the ratio of NAD+ to NADH in mitochondria, and it can increase the expression of genes encoding for various antioxidant molecules. Third, beta-hydroxybutyrate increases the expression of various neurotrophins and attenuates the activity of p53 by binding directly to lysine residues on the molecule. In combination with the previous effects described, these effects work to protect neurons from stress and injury and prevent apoptosis. Beta-hydroxybutyrate changes the expression of genes in a couple different ways. First, it inhibits histone deacetylases, or so-called HDACs. HDACs remove acetyl groups from the histone molecules that chromosomes are wrapped around, which causes chromosomes to bind more tightly around the histones, and this generally reduces gene expression in the location where this occurs. By inhibiting this deacetylation in specific locations in the genome, beta-hydroxybutyrate thus promotes the expression of genes coding for proteins like brain-derived neurotrophic factor, antioxidants such as superoxide dismutase, and other factors that influence things such as energy production. Beta-hydroxybutyrate can also itself bind to lysine residues in histones, which enhances expression of genes involved in various starvation pathways. Through these and many other mechanisms mediated by beta-hydroxybutyrate, the authors point out the potential of the ketogenic diet to mitigate aging and prevent age-related diseases such as cancer, neurological disorders, cardiovascular diseases, muscular dysfunction, inflammatory diseases, and metabolic syndrome. In summary, preliminary studies in animals and in vitro suggest the ketogenic diet might be a viable anti-aging strategy. But what about the effects of the ketogenic diet on body composition and physical performance? I described feeling like a new, highly energetic being after adapting to a ketogenic state. But what does scientific research say about its effects across athletic and other populations? Metabolically, the first thing to point out is that since free fatty acids and ketone bodies must ultimately be plugged into the Krebs cycle to generate energy, utilizing them for fuel requires oxygen, and so their metabolism is rate limited by the diffusion of oxygen from the bloodstream into cells. In contrast, although glucose is processed into pyruvate, which can be groomed into acetyl coenzyme A and inputted into the Krebs cycle as well, under conditions where oxygen is limited, such as when the rate of physical activity is outpacing the rate of diffusion of oxygen into cells, cells rely on processing glucose in the absence of oxygen to meet the immediate energy requirements. Therefore, the more intense an exercise is, the more the body relies on burning glucose for fuel, and the less it can depend on burning other substrates, such as free fatty acids and ketone bodies. Thus, one would expect the ketogenic diet to not drastically impact performance for low-intensity exercises or brief bursts of activity that are performed after adequate rest, but to negatively affect performance in intense activities that are relatively long in duration, which heavily rely on tapping into glycogen stores to fuel the effort. Fortunately, there are more human studies that have investigated these questions, although long-term studies are still lacking. Additionally, answers on the matter are somewhat difficult to obtain due to there being notable variation in study quality, protocol, and populations. Nonetheless, some meta-analyses have been done that have examined the effects across a range of individual studies. A 2021 meta-analysis called Effects of Resistance Training Combined with a Ketogenic Diet on Body Composition, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis, looked at the effect of resistance training combined with ketogenic diets on body mass, fat-free mass, body mass index, and body fat percentage in comparison to those of resistance training while on non-ketogenic diets. The analysis incorporated 13 randomized controlled trials that covered 244 subjects in total, including trained and untrained subjects, and calculated that relative to control diets, on average, ketogenic diets led to significant decreases in all of the measures of body composition investigated. This suggests that a ketogenic diet can be used to cut weight, including fat mass, but that such a diet does tend to decrease fat-free mass relative to a non-keto diet as well. This can partially be attributable to glycogen depletion from muscles and the subsequent excretion of the associated water from the body due to the diuretic effect of a ketogenic state. But the authors identify a couple possible mechanisms by which a ketogenic diet could promote net muscle protein breakdown. First, the low intramuscular glycogen concentrations induced by a ketogenic diet can upregulate AMPK activity in muscle cells, which ultimately inhibits mTOR activity and therefore limits muscle protein synthesis. Second, carbohydrate consumption can spare muscle protein breakdown, particularly in combination with protein intake, and this effect appears to be mediated by insulin. In short, when carbohydrate intake is restricted, the body taps into protein stores in the muscles in order to perform gluconeogenesis. It's important to point out, however, that although the pooled decrease in fat-free mass was statistically significant, it was also relatively small in magnitude, 1.26 kilograms, or about 2.8 pounds on average. Finally, it's worth noting that significant decreases in body composition measures only occurred in studies where calorie intake was not controlled between the two dietary conditions. In other words, it is possible that the ketogenic diet works for body mass loss, at least partially, by simply suppressing appetite and thus decreasing calorie intake. A 2022 meta-analysis called Effects of the Ketogenic Diet on Performance and Body Composition in Athletes and Trained Adults, a systematic review and Bayesian, multivariate, multi-level meta-analysis and meta-regression, performed a similar study pooling process, but also included studies of aerobic activities and investigated the effects of ketogenic diets on physical performance in addition to their effects on body composition. Specifically, this meta-analysis investigated the effect of ketogenic diets on body mass, fat-free mass, one repetition maximum strength, and mean power output of cycling, running, and race walking tasks in comparison to those of non-ketogenic diets. This meta-analysis incorporated 16 trials that covered 290 trained subjects and found results for body composition similar to those of the previous meta-analysis, estimating that ketogenic diets on average lead to lower body mass, fat mass, and fat-free mass than control diets. Similarly to the previous meta-analysis, the estimated average difference in fat-free mass was found to be small in magnitude, only 0.8 kilograms, or about 1.76 pounds. For physical performance, the analysis estimated that ketogenic diets lead to a 1-rep max strength on average about 5.7% lower than that resulting from non-ketogenic diets. Additionally, the analysis estimated lower mean power outputs during the various activities for subjects on ketogenic diets compared to those on control diets, noting that the estimated average difference in performance was largest for short-duration activities and for athletes with better cardiovascular conditioning, as measured by VO2 max. The analysis also estimated that this difference decreased as subjects became more keto-adapted. Note that, as the authors point out, these results don't necessarily mean ketogenic diets decrease strength and power output while non-ketogenic diets increase them. Rather, these measures represent the average percent differences between the two conditions, so it's possible these measures increased or decreased for both dietary conditions over the training period, but just to different extents. In summary, while some individual studies find no performance decrement resulting from a ketogenic diet, the weight of the evidence suggests that ketogenic diets are not optimal for many athletic activities, at least in the short term, that is to say, 3 months or less. These effects are very likely modified by several factors, including protein intake, workout programming, and keto adaptation beyond a few months, and the results are also possibly confounded by differences in calorie intake between the different dietary conditions. Further research is needed to investigate the effects of ketogenic diets on physical performance and body composition while accounting for these factors. That all said, one strategy for overcoming these apparent limitations is a cyclical ketogenic diet. When one periodically refeeds carbohydrates, they shift their hormonal profile back to a more anabolic one conducive to muscular hypertrophy, and they replenish their glycogen stores in the liver and muscles to help fuel vigorous activities. If one incorporates a weekly 36-hour window, for example, where fat intake is drastically reduced and replaced with carbohydrate intake, then there will be a regular period of time each week where glycogen is replenished and insulin levels are increased. This directly promotes muscular anabolism while also refueling the muscles for better performance during high-volume workouts, thus also indirectly promoting hypertrophy. This is why I personally use a cyclical ketogenic diet. This way, one can achieve the benefits of a ketogenic diet we've discussed here, while strategically using carb-ups to facilitate greater muscular hypertrophy and athletic performance for certain activities. Additionally, it is reasonable to suppose that due to the improvement in insulin sensitivity caused by the ketogenic diet, when one does refeed with carbohydrates and induce greater insulin response, muscle cells will likely react to the increased insulin more strongly than otherwise, though as far as I know, this remains to be experimentally verified. Research is needed here to account for variation across individuals and to control for other factors, but anecdotally speaking, I've achieved the greatest amount of muscular development while eating a cyclical ketogenic diet in comparison to a full ketogenic diet. In terms of performance, I noticed that my maximal and near maximal lifting efforts don't appear to be significantly affected by a ketogenic diet as long as I rest for long periods of time in between sets, and that I can sustain low-intensity efforts practically indefinitely while in a ketogenic state. However, I tend to gas out on keto while doing moderate to high-intensity exercises with more volume or for longer durations than those involved in only doing a few repetitions or less. Examples include high-volume bodybuilding style workouts and high-intensity interval training. This makes sense metabolically. Brief near-maximal and maximal attempts, although they are anaerobic activities, simply rely on using the ATP and creatine phosphate molecules that are already available in muscle cells. And so these tasks aren't as dependent on burning glucose for fuel as activities involving sustained bursts of intense activity. And low-intensity activities like jogging and lifting light weights can easily be sustained through aerobic respiration, which can handily be fueled by free fatty acids and ketone bodies. However, it is those sustained or repeated bursts of intense activity that require tapping into glycogen reserves in order to perform optimally. While there is some evidence that keto adaptation can increase the intensity threshold at which this greater requirement for glucose comes into play, this threshold is nonetheless still there. By strategically replenishing one's glycogen reserves, it is possible to restore performance in these kinds of activities when that threshold is crossed. So should you try the ketogenic diet? It's ultimately up to you. There's definitely promising preliminary evidence that the ketogenic diet can extend lifespan and health span. Further, a ketogenic diet doesn't appear to degrade fat-free mass or physical performance during most activities too severely, particularly when calorie intake is strictly controlled. And doing a cyclical ketogenic diet can potentially improve fat-free mass gains and restore performance in activities that heavily rely on glycogen stores. So, I recommend everyone try it out at least once in their lives. It is definitely an intriguing approach to taking one step closer towards immortality. By keying into many of the same metabolic and genetic pathways that strategies like caloric restriction do, it appears to achieve the same benefits without actually having to deprive oneself of nutrients needed to continue physically growing and developing, and while providing the energy needed to enjoy life. It's worth experimenting on yourself if biohacking and self-optimization interest you. If the diet doesn't work for you, then no problem. There are certainly other healthy diets out there you can use to improve your long-term health. And, as discussed in the review article on beta-hydroxybutyrate as an anti-aging metabolite, it might even be possible to supplement with ketone esters to achieve some of the metabolic, signaling, and epigenetic benefits of a ketogenic diet without having to eat ketogenically. For those of you who do decide to go forward with the ketogenic diet, just keep in mind that this is an experimental approach, and that there are currently no longitudinal studies on humans that have looked at the long-term effects of the ketogenic diet on aging. The preliminary evidence so far is promising, but it will be important to keep up on emerging evidence in the future. Now, if you want to try out a ketogenic diet, here are some practical tips I've compiled together based on my experience over the past decade and a half of ketogenic eating. First, and most fundamentally, as we discussed earlier, a ketogenic diet practically eliminates carbohydrates from the diet. This leaves the remaining two types of macronutrients, fats and proteins. In order to spare protein for being used for fuel, so that it can be used for structural and other functional purposes, the percentage of calories coming from fats must be kept high, about 70%, with most of the remainder coming from protein. I suggest a minimum caloric percentage of 60% coming from fats. Second, do not eat a purely carnivorous diet. While much of the mechanistic reasoning behind carnivore appears logically valid, the reality is that such conclusions simply don't pan out when tested with empirical evidence. For example, proponents of carnivore claim that the anti-nutrients in plant foods will prevent nutrient absorption and cause nutrient deficiencies. But the reality is there are populations across the globe that regularly consume plants with such anti-nutrients that do not exhibit widespread nutrient deficiencies. This suggests that either the anti-nutrients don't block the absorption of as many molecules as supposed, or that the body can perhaps adapt to their ingestion by, for example, making absorption more efficient or by excreting less of a given nutrient from the body. After almost dogmatically adhering to a purely carnivorous diet for years, I finally conceded that this approach is not optimal for long-term human health. One can certainly survive on a purely carnivorous diet if done right, but plant foods provide too many well-documented benefits to forego them if one is seeking optimal health. And their supposed drawbacks fail to corroborate with experimental evidence. In fact, short-chain fatty acids produced by gut microbiota that feed on plant material can induce further ketogenesis in the liver, thus actually facilitating a ketogenic state. In short, eat your veggies. Next, following on the idea of tracking caloric percentages, make a deliberate effort to count your macronutrients and total calories, and track how much you're eating throughout the day. As I mentioned earlier, on a ketogenic diet, your liver is converting various substrates into glucose since your body isn't getting the sugar it needs from your diet. As a result of this, your body is tightly controlling your blood sugar levels. There is no sudden influx of sugar into the bloodstream when you eat, thus no large surge of insulin to shuttle the incoming sugar to cells throughout the body, and therefore no dip in blood sugar caused by this clearance from the bloodstream. This dip in blood sugar is one of the main physiological triggers for hunger, including a growling and aching stomach. Without these normal signals to eat on a ketogenic diet, it is very easy to go several hours without eating and not even notice. This is fine if you want to fast or cut weight, but if you want to maintain weight or grow muscle, you will want to remind yourself to eat in order to consume enough nutrients. In fact, although subjects eating ketogenically tend to eat more protein than subjects on controlled diets, as mentioned in both of the meta-analyses examining the impact of the ketogenic diet on body composition and/or physical performance that we discussed earlier, it is possible that the observed decrements in fat-free mass could be ameliorated by increasing protein intake further in order to compensate for the increased rate of muscle breakdown that occurs to provide the amino acids needed for gluconeogenesis. When in a ketogenic state, while doing exercise that requires anaerobic bursts of activity, I recommend resting a bare minimum of 5 minutes in between efforts. This will give your muscle cells the time they need to replenish their ATP stores, and also give your liver a bit of time to create more glucose that can be used for the next effort. Often, when I'm lifting weights in the middle of a keto day, I will rest up to 10 minutes in between sets. When recovering from a workout on keto, focus on increasing protein intake for the next several meals. Amino acids trigger about 40% of the insulin response that glucose does, so spiking yourself with some extra protein following a workout can help nudge your muscles into a slightly more anabolic state in spite of the reduced intramuscular glycogen stores. When implementing a cyclical ketogenic diet, try to schedule the workouts that are moderate to high in both intensity and volume on or shortly after refeed days. Do a purely ketogenic diet for at least several months before experimenting with doing a cyclical ketogenic diet. This will give your body time to adapt to a ketogenic metabolism and thus make it better able to switch between a normal carbohydrate burning metabolism and a ketogenic one. It takes time for your cell's genetic expression to change to efficiently carry out a ketogenic metabolism. If you cycle between the two metabolisms too early on in your keto journey, you will never fully adapt to a ketogenic metabolism, and you will thus persistently experience the so-called keto flu whenever you switch to the keto portion of the week. You might also feel sluggish and sick when transitioning back to a carbohydrate metabolism. I've seen someone literally sick up when they attempted to eat a bunch of donuts after doing their first couple weeks of keto. The end result of this premature yo-yoing is that you will always be jerking your metabolism around and ultimately trashing your energy and health. Be patient, stick to the standard ketogenic diet for a few months, allow your body to adapt to a ketogenic state, and only then consider carefully implementing a cyclic approach with some carbohydrate refeeds. A corollary to this tip is the following. When transitioning to a carbohydrate metabolism, be sure to start your carb up with low glycemic index foods, such as foods with a lot of complex carbohydrates that are high in fiber, like oatmeal. This will lead to a slower trickle of carbohydrates into your bloodstream, and thus gently ease you into a carbohydrate burning metabolism and avoid shocking your system. Conversely, when transitioning back to a ketogenic metabolism, it is advisable to fast for a few hours after waking up before eating your first keto meal for the week. You will already be somewhat ketotic from fasting while sleeping, and an extra few hours of fasting will help nudge you deeper into ketosis. I also strongly recommend exercising on your first keto day in order to speed up the glycogen depletion and fat release processes. and thus actually push you into nutritional ketosis within a day or two. If you don't fast and exercise like this, you will probably protract the process of actually getting into ketosis to the point that you will only be in it for a day or two before starting your next carb up. This delayed entry into ketosis will thus reduce the amount of time you're actually in it, and thus minimize the benefits of eating a ketogenic diet. Finally, when doing a carb up, don't treat it as a cheat day where you can indiscriminately splurge on junk food. It's fine to occasionally treat yourself to a restaurant meal or some pizza, but in general, while you're carbing up, you want to bring the amount of fat you're consuming way down and replace it with carbohydrates, most of them coming from foods with at least some fiber in them. Essentially, you want to follow a healthy low-fat diet while you are carbing up. Alright everyone, that's all for this video. I hope you found my story interesting and the information and practical advice useful. So, which diet do you use to improve your long-term health and functioning? If you've done a ketogenic diet before, share your experience below. If you haven't tried it yet, try it out and let me know what your experience is. I will see you next time. Remember, the process is the goal.